Kuro steps into the courtroom. The injustice that lingers. Kuro took a deep breath, adjusted the cuffs of his gray suit, and pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse. Monday mornings here were always a frenzy, a hive buzzing with activity as attorneys rushed in and out. Court clerks shuffled through stacks of paperwork, and defendants sat in silent anticipation, waiting for their fate to be decided. The scent of burnt coffee mixed with faint traces of perfume lingered in the air, but none of it distracted Kuro. He was no stranger to this courthouse, not as a defendant, nor as a plaintiff, but as a businessman entangled in a grueling legal battle with Reynard Holdings, a company he once trusted. The contract dispute had dragged on for over 6 months, and today, Kuro hoped to finally make some progress in resolving it. Approaching the check-in desk, he handed his documents to the court clerk, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stony expression. The man glanced at Kuro briefly before lowering his eyes to the paperwork. But then something changed. A hesitation, a pause just long enough to not be coincidental. Kuro watched his expression carefully, noticing the subtle shift, the fleeting look he had grown all too familiar with throughout his life. "Carter, Kuro?" the clerk asked, his tone devoid of warmth. "Yes," Kuro replied, keeping his voice steady. The clerk cleared his throat but no longer looked Kuro in the eye. "You'll need to wait outside." Kuro frowned. "Outside?" The man nodded and gestured toward a row of metal benches along the far wall, a place where others, people who looked like him, sat waiting. He took in the sight. Some sat quietly, eyes fixed on their phones. Others bounced their legs anxiously. Meanwhile, others, those who didn't look like him, were allowed through without question. Kuro clenched his jaw. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something else, and it was only just beginning. Kuro's wait, when justice isn't for everyone. Kuro sat on the cold metal bench, his briefcase still gripped firmly in his hands. He glanced at his watch. 8:47 a.m. Still early, but he was supposed to be inside the courtroom by now. He had arrived on time, paperwork in order, yet instead he was told to wait, without a clear reason. Time passed. One by one, others approached the check-in desk. A middle-aged man in a blue polo shirt and khakis took no more than 15 seconds to be admitted into the courtroom. A young blonde woman in a beige pencil skirt was through in just 10. The court clerk barely glanced at their paperwork before waving them forward. None of them were told to wait. Kuro tightened his grip on the briefcase, feeling tension creep into his muscles. Maybe this was just a clerical error, a bureaucratic oversight, but this feeling of being sidelined, of being dismissed, wasn't new to him. A deep voice broke through his thoughts. "They call you in yet?" Kuro turned to his left. A graying man sat 2 seats away, his eyes filled with quiet knowing. "Not yet," Kuro replied, keeping his tone even. The man hummed, tapping his fingers lightly on the armrest. "Didn't think so." Kuro frowned. "What do you mean?" The man smirked, a hint of cynicism in his expression. But before he could respond, a black woman in a red blazer stepped up to the check-in desk. The clerk barely glanced at her before mumbling something and jerking his head toward the waiting area, the same area Kuro had been told to sit. She sighed, then walked over and sat farther down the bench. Kuro glanced at her, then back at the check-in desk. The ones who looked like him waited. The others did not. He checked his watch again. 9:15 a.m. A white man rushed into the courthouse, muttering about being late. No one asked. No one stopped him. He waved a stack of documents, and just like that, he was allowed inside immediately. Kuro shot up from his seat. "Excuse me." His voice was calm but firm. "I've been waiting for nearly 45 minutes. Why is he allowed in while I'm not? The court clerk barely looked up, his expression filled with annoyance. You'll be called when we're ready. Kuro clenched his jaw. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a clerical error. This was injustice. The unjust wait. When Kuro sees the truth, Kuro tightened his grip on the leather handle of his briefcase, a heavy weight settling in his chest as he watched one person after another pass through the courtroom doors without resistance. He was still being told to wait. But for what reason? A voice beside him pulled him from his thoughts. Do you see it? Kuro turned. The graying man next to him was watching the scene unfold with sharp eyes. I see it, Kuro replied slowly. And do you understand what it means? Kuro didn't need to answer. He already knew. It wasn't a coincidence that he had been held back. It wasn't random that only people like him were told to wait. At that moment, the double doors at the end of the hallway swung open, and a woman in a black robe stepped inside. Judge Varys. Her stern face scanned the room, and the sharpness in her gaze landed on Kuro immediately. You're still sitting here? Her voice cut through the air, freezing the hallway in place. The court clerk, Officer Aradam, jerked in surprise, fumbling through the stack of paperwork on his desk. I was just processing his file. Varys strode forward, holding out her hand. Let me see. Aradam hesitated, but under the judge's ice-cold stare, he had no choice. He handed over Kuro's file, and Varys flipped through the pages. The room was silent enough that Kuro could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Then, Varys's lips pressed into a thin line. She lifted her gaze, staring directly at Aradam. This file was cleared before 9 a.m., she said, her voice low but razor sharp. So why isn't he inside the courtroom? Aradam opened his mouth, but no words came out. Varys inhaled slowly, her eyes sweeping across the room. Lawyers, defendants, and court staff were all watching. They had seen everything. This delay wasn't a mistake. Mr. Carter, Varys turned to Kuro. Go inside. Now. Kuro said nothing. He stood, adjusted his suit, and stepped through the double doors, leaving behind an air of thick tension. But just as he crossed into the courtroom, a voice rang out behind him. This isn't over. He didn't need to turn around to know who had spoken, and he knew whatever happened next, it would change everything. The truth exposed. When Varys asks the question. As Kuro stepped into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Gone was the heavy weight of the hallway, the disdainful looks from the court clerk. But within the solemn space of the courtroom, he could sense the undercurrents of something much deeper brewing beneath the surface. Judge Varys took her seat at the bench, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room. She didn't speak immediately, simply observing Kuro intently before turning her focus toward the court clerk. Before we begin this case, her voice rang out deep and authoritative, there is a matter that needs addressing. The room fell completely silent. Mr. Kuro, she continued, I have been informed that you were told to wait outside, despite your hearing being scheduled for 9 a.m. Is that correct? Kuro gave a firm nod. That is correct, Your Honor. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Murmurs began to spread among the attorneys and attendees. Varys turned to the court clerk near the entrance. Officer Aradam, do you have a reason for detaining Mr. Kuro outside? Aradam stiffened, his face betraying the tension simmering beneath his attempt at composure. Your Honor, it was just a minor oversight. We had multiple cases to process this morning. Sometimes. Hand me his file. Varys extended her hand. Aradam swallowed hard, but had no choice but to comply. He handed over Kuro's file, and Varys flipped through the pages. her sharp eyes scanning each line as if peeling back layers of concealed truth. The courtroom held its breath. 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Finally, Varys closed the file and placed it deliberately on her desk. She locked eyes with Aradam. This file was stamped and approved before 9 a.m. So why was he made to wait outside? Aradam parted his lips to respond, but whatever excuse he had prepared was already meaningless. Varys leaned back in her chair, fingers interlaced in front of her. Officer Aradam, how many times have you done this before? The air thickened. This was no longer a simple inquiry. This was a confrontation. Aradam hesitated. He swallowed. The tension in the room reached a suffocating peak, and Kuro knew this was the moment when the truth would finally come to light. The terrifying silence. When Aradam is cornered. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. Every pair of eyes in the room was locked onto Officer Aradam, waiting for his response. Judge Varys leaned back in her chair, fingers still interlaced, her gaze as sharp as a blade slicing straight through Aradam, stripping away any illusion he had left to hide behind. Kuro remained seated, but he could feel his heartbeat accelerating. This was the most crucial moment since he had stepped into the courthouse that morning. How many times have you done this before? Varys repeated, her tone unchanged, but the pressure in the room had grown so dense it could crush steel. Aradam licked his lips, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route, but there was none. I don't remember exactly, he muttered, his voice so low it was almost inaudible. Varys arched a brow. You don't remember? I was just following procedure. Aradam suddenly raised his voice, as if trying to justify himself, but no one in the room believed a word of it. A scoff came from the far side of the room. One of the attorneys from Reynard Holdings was watching Aradam as if he had just dug his own grave. Varys never broke eye contact. Then let me remind you, in the past 2 weeks alone, at least 5 other individuals were ordered to wait outside. Every single one of them had one thing in common. She let the words hang in the air for a moment. They all looked like Mr. Kuro. The room erupted into murmurs. Kuro clenched his fists, but he kept his expression neutral. He had known this, but hearing it spoken aloud, out in the open, it felt like a truth being permanently stamped into reality. Aradam swallowed hard. I didn't. No excuses, Officer Aradam. Varys's voice sliced through his stammering like a razor-sharp knife. Your actions are clear, and I assure you, they will not be forgotten. A suffocating silence settled over the room, and in that moment, Kuro realized he was no longer the one on trial. It was the system itself that had just been dragged into the light. The truth unveiled. When Kuro confronts Aradam, the courtroom held its breath. No one moved. No one dared to break the suffocating tension that hung in the air like a thick fog. Judge Varys stood with her arms crossed, her gaze sharp and unwavering, as if nothing could escape her scrutiny. Across from her, Aradam sat frozen, beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the room. Kuro remained silent, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. This was the moment when the truth was laid bare for all to see. Varys slowly tapped her fingers against the desk, each tap like a drumbeat of impending judgment. So you were instructed to delay Mr. Kuro's case, she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. Aradam swallowed hard, fumbling for words. I was just following procedure. Varys tilted her head slightly, as if considering his excuse. Procedure? She repeated, her voice echoing through the courtroom. Can you tell me exactly which procedure requires certain individuals to wait for hours while others walk straight inside? Aradam opened his mouth, but no words came out. A deadly silence filled the courtroom. And let me ask you another question. Varys leaned forward, her eyes piercing through Aradam's last line of defense. Was it William Crestwell who gave you that order? The air in the room shifted instantly. All eyes turned toward Crestwell, the man seated at the far end of the courtroom. His face paled, his usual smug smirk wiped clean. He lifted his chin, trying to maintain his composure, but the confidence he once wore like armor was now cracked and brittle. Aradam flicked his gaze toward Crestwell. Kuro saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that he was nothing more than a disposable pawn in a much larger power play. Aradam swallowed, his voice shaky. I was given direct orders. The courtroom erupted. Whispers and murmurs spread like wildfire. Lawyers exchanged knowing glances. Journalists scribbled furiously, cameras flashing as they captured the unraveling of a conspiracy in real time. Kuro clenched his fist, but this time it wasn't out of anger. It was because he knew justice was finally tipping in his favor. Varys let the weight of the confession settle in the room. She didn't speak for several long seconds, allowing the magnitude of what had just been revealed to sink into every corner of the courtroom. Finally, she exhaled, turning her sharp gaze back to Aradam. Do you understand the consequences of your confession? Aradam bowed his head. He knew there was no escape now, and for the first time since he walked into this courthouse, Kuro felt like he wasn't the one on trial. The system itself was finally being held accountable. When justice speaks, Kuro turns the tables as Aradam lowered his head, confessing to his wrongdoing. The courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs. Some attorneys exchanged glances, while others gave knowing nods, as if witnessing a pivotal moment in legal history. Kuro remained still, but inside a storm raged. This was no longer just a trial. This was a battle between those who abused their power and those who dared to stand against them. Varys didn't need any further words. She slowly turned, her piercing gaze locking onto Crestwell, the man who now looked like a trapped animal. Mr. Crestwell, her voice rang out, each syllable deliberate and sharp. Do you have anything to say regarding this allegation? Crestwell clenched his jaw, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and unease. Judge Varys, this is simply a misunderstanding. I have never. Varys raised her hand, cutting off his attempt at justification. No need for explanations. I will be filing a formal report with the Bar Association regarding your misconduct. Interfering with court proceedings is unacceptable. Silence filled the room. Kuro slowly turned his head, watching as Crestwell's expression contorted with barely contained fury. In that moment, Kuro realized something. Men like Crestwell never truly believed they could be caught, but this time he was wrong. Varys continued, her voice sharp as a blade. This court does not tolerate bias. No one manipulates justice for their own benefit. She then turned to the court clerk. Record this in the official transcript. Officer Aradam is immediately suspended pending further investigation. William Crestwell's actions will be formally reviewed by the Bar Association. The weight of her words struck like a thunderclap. Crestwell shot up from his seat, his face flushed with indignation. Your Honor, this is— You've heard the ruling, Varys replied without a flicker of hesitation. Kuro watched as Crestwell's confidence crumbled beneath the weight of his own arrogance. For years, Kuro had fought to be treated fairly, to not be sidelined for reasons unspoken yet undeniable. Today, he had won, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been denied the justice they deserved, and this was only the beginning. When justice is revealed, Kuro and the undeniable truth. The courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. All eyes were fixed on Aradam, who now sat frozen in the witness stand. Beads of sweat trickled down his temples. Varys showed no signs of impatience. She flipped a page in her document, her piercing gaze locking onto him. "I will ask one last time, Officer Aradam. Did you or did you not receive orders from William Crestwell to delay Mr. Kuro's trial?" There was no escape. Aradam swallowed hard. He could hear the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. He glanced quickly at Crestwell, but the man refused to meet his gaze, sitting motionless, his face as emotionless as a stone statue. Finally, Aradam's voice came out, weak and brittle. "Yes, boom!" The entire courtroom erupted into murmurs of disbelief. Kuro clenched his fists, but he did not smile, nor did he revel in victory. This was never about personal triumph. This was proof of a truth that had been buried for far too long. Varys nodded slowly. "It is now clear." She turned to the court recorder. "Enter into the record. Officer Aradam has admitted to receiving orders to deliberately delay legal proceedings, violating the principles of justice." Crestwell suddenly shot up from his seat. "Your Honor, this is an unsubstantiated claim." Varys did not even look at him. She simply tapped her fingers lightly against the wooden desk. "Mr. Crestwell, I have met many men like you." Her voice was calm, yet carried an unshakable weight. "Men who believe they can bend the law to their will." Crestwell clenched his jaw, his fists tightening. But he said nothing more. Varys turned to Kuro. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for this unjust delay." Kuro met her gaze, sensing the sincerity in her words. For the first time today, he felt like he was truly being heard. The court had spoken the truth, and no one could change that. When justice is laid bare, Kuro and the inescapable confession. The courtroom was thick with tension, suffocating in its weight. Aradam sat on the witness stand, his hands clenched together, his face pale. He had nowhere left to run. The room was silent, every person present holding their breath, waiting for his next words. Varys stood firm, her sharp gaze cutting through him like a blade. She was in no rush, offering no mercy. Slowly, deliberately, she asked one last time, "Officer Aradam, did you receive orders from William Crestwell to delay Mr. Kuro's trial, yes or no?" The air felt drained from the room. Aradam took a deep breath, but when he spoke, his voice trembled. "Yes." The silence that followed was deafening, like an explosion with no sound. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of shock. Heads turned toward one another, disbelief etched on their faces. From the opposing counsel's table, Crestwell abruptly stood. "Your Honor, this testimony is completely unfounded." Varys did not blink. She simply lifted a hand, a silent command for silence. "Mr. Crestwell, I advise you to choose your words very carefully." Crestwell gritted his teeth, but he said nothing more. He knew he had been cornered. Varys continued, her voice echoing through the hushed room. "Court clerk, enter it into the record. Officer Aradam has officially admitted to an unlawful arrangement, knowingly obstructing justice." Kuro clenched his hands, but not in anger. It was the weight of justice finally being served. He had fought too long for this moment. Varys turned to him. "Mr. Kuro, I apologize for this unjust delay." Kuro took a deep breath, locking eyes with the judge, and for the first time, he saw someone who truly stood for what was right. The system could be bent, manipulated, but today, the truth had prevailed. Justice cannot be stolen. Kuro and the transformation of an entire system as Kuro stepped out of the courthouse. The morning air felt lighter, yet his mind remained heavy. What had just transpired inside was not merely a personal victory. It was a declaration, a statement that justice could not be manipulated forever. Aradam had confessed, Crestwell had been backed into a corner, and Varys, with her unwavering firmness, had turned the morning's trial into a lesson the entire judicial system would not soon forget. Behind him, the courthouse loomed, no longer just a symbol of protection, but a monument to endless battles. How many people had walked through those doors, only to be denied justice because those in power twisted the law to their will? He was not the first to be treated this way, but today he had refused to stay silent. A familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. Cora, he turned to see Varys standing a few steps away. For the first time that morning, she no longer bore the rigid expression she had worn in the courtroom. Instead, she looked exhausted, but satisfied. She crossed her arms, studying him for a moment before offering a slight nod. You did it. Kuro smirked slightly. Not just me. Varys exhaled, then glanced back toward the courthouse. I've been in this job long enough to know that change doesn't come easily. But days like today, she turned back to him. Days like today remind me that it's still possible. Kuro tightened his grip on his briefcase. Today they had won a battle, but the real fight was far from over. He took one last look at Varys before turning to walk away. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. They would never silence him again. The truth cannot be buried. Kuro faces the system. As Kuro stepped out of the courtroom, eyes still followed him. Some were filled with curiosity, some with respect, and others with fear and hatred. He had done what few dared, confronted a system that had long thrived on abusing its power. Crestwell, the man who believed he could manipulate the law like a puppet on strings, now sat in silence. Under the weight of the trial, his web of lies had collapsed, leaving him with nothing but disgrace. Aradam fared no better. When questioned before the court, his hesitation and fear were laid bare for all to see. He was no longer the powerful court official he once pretended to be. Just a man who had exploited the system until it turned against him. And Varys, she still stood firm, an unshakable force against those who sought to twist justice for their own gain. A judge who could not be bought, who would not waver. Kuro took a deep breath, realizing one undeniable truth. Today they had changed a part of the system, but this was not the end. Today, the truth had won. But how many others like him had been left without a voice? How many had been told to wait outside simply because someone in power decided they should? Kuro tightened his grip on his briefcase. He was not the first victim, and he would not allow himself to be the last. The system had turned its back on those it was meant to protect for far too long. Today was a turning point. And he wasn't stopping here. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the morning light fell upon his shoulders, a sign of a new beginning. Justice is not a choice. Kuro becomes the torch. Kuro stood on the courthouse steps, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. No one left immediately. They remained there, still captivated by what had unfolded inside. The moment when a long-buried truth was finally dragged into the light. He had seen the shift in Varys's expression as she declared what everyone knew, but no one dared to say. Bias was not accidental, it was deliberate, and today someone had to pay the price. Crestwell, the man who once sat with smug confidence, now looked like a shadow of himself. His carefully laid plans had crumbled. He hadn't just lost credibility, he was on the brink of losing everything. Aradam, the court official who believed he could toy with people's fate at will, now stood as nothing more than a fallen figure, As he was escorted from the building, he couldn't even meet Kuro's eyes. But this victory didn't bring Kuro relief, because this wasn't just his story. Today, the system had been forced to acknowledge its wrongdoing. But what about those who never got the chance to stand before a judge like Varys? Those who were pushed aside, ignored, and silenced? Kuro clenched his fists. This was only the beginning. He couldn't change an entire system in a single day. But today, he had cracked it. And every action from this moment forward would be another hammer strike, chipping away at the injustices that had stood for far too long. He turned and stepped down, not to walk away, but to move forward, because justice is not a choice, it is a necessity, and Kuro would not stop until it belonged to everyone. The system has shaken. Kuro won't let it return to the way it was. As Kuro stepped out of the courtroom, he could feel the invisible shift in the air. This was no longer just another ordinary morning, no longer just another trial where those in power could bend the law at their will. Today, they had lost. Varys had silenced the entire room when she called for an official investigation into the systematic bias that Aradam once thought he could cover up. No one could stop her. Not the scheming court officials, not Crestwell's lawyers, and certainly not the system that had shielded them for so long. Kuro scanned the crowd. No one had left yet. The eyes watching him were not just filled with shock, but also with something more: hope. They had witnessed something they never thought possible. Someone who dared to stand up, to fight back, and to win. He didn't need to look at Crestwell to know exactly how he felt. A man who thrived on power and control wouldn't accept defeat easily. But Kuro also understood something else. This wasn't the final battle. People like Crestwell didn't disappear. They would retreat, regroup, and try to rebuild the balance that had been shattered today. But Kuro was no longer just one man standing alone. The system had cracked, and he would not let it settle back into place. Taking a deep breath, he clenched his briefcase, feeling the weight of the battle ahead. He was no longer someone who simply accepted injustice. He was someone who made them worry, someone who made them afraid. Justice is not given, it must be fought. For Kuro's story is not just about a trial or a personal battle. It is a wake-up call to the realities of injustice and how to confront it. The legal system, which is meant to protect all, has cracks that allow the powerful to manipulate and oppress those with less. But that does not mean we must accept it. Kuro chose to fight back. He refused to let injustice silence him, refused to let those with more power crush his voice. And because of his persistence, the truth was finally exposed. Justice does not come on its own. It must be claimed. The most important lesson from this story is this: we cannot change a system with hope alone. Change requires action. When faced with injustice, we all have two choices: bow down and accept it, or stand up and demand what is rightfully ours. The silence of one person may not seem significant, but when many voices rise together, change begins. One person can start it, but a community can make the difference. Justice is not just written in laws. It is in how people protect and enforce it. And Kuro proved that even in a system that seems unshakable, with enough determination, we can create a crack, and from there, open the door to change. Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.